Dr. Marcus cornered the charge nurse, using his chief of surgery voice to bury the assault like a minor clerical error. But he forgot one detail. Dr. Eris, the attending on duty, wasn't on our family's payroll. He looked right through my father and ordered the scan that would shatter my family's facade forever. Before I show you the medical records that dismantled their empire, drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community. The X-rays illuminated the viewing screen, displaying the hairline fracture in my ulna and the deep bruising along my ribs. The evidence was irrefutable. My sister, Brianna, had struck me in a fit of rage over a misplaced residency application file, and my father had rushed me here to ensure the incident remained off the official record. I looked at the stark white lines of my broken bones. I didn't cry. I didn't shake. I simply pulled out my phone. I opened the group chat with my mother, Cynthia, and my sister. I typed a single, clinical sentence. The police have been notified and the medical records are secured. I hit send. No hesitation. For 22 years, I had been the silent variable in their carefully balanced equation. I was the invisible child, designed to absorb Brianna's volatility while my mother looked the other way. People often wonder why a person stays silent for so long in an abusive environment. It is not because of loyalty, and it is certainly not because of love. It is the invisible chain of survival. When you are conditioned from childhood to believe that your safety depends on your compliance, you learn to calculate the exact cost of your existence. You become an expert at risk assessment, measuring the price of speaking up against the guarantee of retaliation. I had tolerated their toxicity because I believed my silence was the premium I had to pay to keep a roof over my head. But staring at that X-ray, the math suddenly changed. The cost of my compliance had just exceeded its value. The return on investment for being the good, quiet daughter was a broken arm and a cover-up. This was no longer a family dynamic. It was a breach of contract. Anger wasn't loud this time. It was entirely analytical. I rubbed my thumb over the screen of my phone, feeling the cool glass. I was done subsidizing their perfect image. From the moment I hit send, the family I knew ceased to exist, replaced entirely by a list of liabilities and assets. When Gavin, my 19-year-old brother, received a new sports car for merely passing his exams, I was the one working overtime to afford my own drafting software. I was the emotional buffer zone, the shock absorber for every family crisis. The invisible chain is built link by link through financial dependence and psychological conditioning, but an X-ray is an objective truth. It doesn't negotiate. I handed the tablet back to Dr. Aris. I told him I needed physical copies of every scan, every note, and every chart. He nodded, his expression grim but supportive. He recognized the shift in my posture. I was no longer the frightened daughter of a powerful surgeon. I was an auditor, and it was time to collect the debts they had been accumulating for over 2 decades. To understand the bankruptcy of our family dynamic, you have to look at the historical ledgers. While my parents poured hundreds of thousands of dollars into Brianna's medical school tuition, her surgical internships, and her designer wardrobe, I was entirely self-funded. I paid for my own education in medical illustration by working 3 part-time jobs. My parents called it building character, but the reality was a gross misallocation of resources. I was essentially the silent financial and emotional laborer for their golden child. Brianna was 24, a surgical resident, and completely incapable of managing her own life. When she failed a rotation, I was drafted to organize her study schedules. When she threw a tantrum and destroyed her apartment, I was the one dispatched to clean it up before the landlord found out. I had been the silent investor in their version of family, footing the bill with my time, my energy, and my sanity. My father, Dr. Marcus, had built his reputation as a pillar of the medical community. My mother, Cynthia, curated our public image with ruthless efficiency. Together, they manufactured a reality where Brianna was a prodigy and Gavin was a rising star, while I was simply the convenient support staff. I remembered the night I received my first major commission as an illustrator. I had been hired by a prestigious medical journal. When I shared the news at the dinner table, my mother immediately pivoted the conversation to Brianna's upcoming gala. My achievement wasn't just ignored. It was actively suppressed because it threatened the established hierarchy. Looking back, I realized their affection had been a subscription, with me footing the bill. They demanded absolute loyalty, but offered zero returns. The disparity wasn't an accident. It was the fundamental business model of our household. I funded my own supplies, my own tuition, my own apartment, while still being taxed emotionally to keep Brianna functional. I was the safety net they never had to pay for. They lavished Gavin with allowances and vacations because he was compliant, a cheerful beneficiary of their toxic favoritism. But my independence was a threat. Every hour I had spent rendering detailed anatomical charts of the human heart was an hour I spent learning how the body functions, how it breaks, and how it heals. I understood structural integrity better than any of them. Our family had none. The foundation was entirely rotten, held together by bribery and silence. I was simply the first one to stop reinforcing the walls. As I sat in the emergency room waiting for the splint to dry on my arm, the final balance was calculated. The family account was officially overdrawn. They had extracted their last ounce of utility from me. I didn't feel a sense of loss. I didn't mourn the parents or the sister I was supposed to have. I simply recognized a bad investment and prepared to liquidate my assets. My mother and sister arrived at the hospital exactly 42 minutes after my text message. They didn't run through the emergency room doors frantically searching for my face. They walked in with purposeful, measured steps, scanning the room for damage control. Cynthia was not worried about the fractured bone in my arm. She was worried about the paperwork. She marched straight up to my bed, her designer handbag clutched tight, her face a mask of irritated inconvenience. "Mara? What is this nonsense about the police?" she hissed, keeping her voice low to avoid attracting attention. "You are not filing a report. Think about what this will do to your sister's career." Brianna stood right behind her, arms crossed, radiating a cold, impenetrable entitlement. She didn't look at my splint. She didn't offer an apology. Instead, she leaned in and glared at me. "You're doing this on purpose," Brianna sneered. "You're trying to ruin my residency application out of pure spite because you're jealous. It was an accident, and you're blowing it out of proportion to get attention." It was a clinical demonstration of a villain's complete lack of accountability. There was no remorse. There was no hesitation. Just an immediate pivot to self-preservation and victim blaming. I looked at the two of them, cataloging their expressions, like data points on a spreadsheet. They weren't shocked by what Brianna had done. They were shocked that I had stopped playing along. "It wasn't an accident," I said, my voice completely flat, devoid of any emotional inflection. "You threw a glass paperweight at my arm because you couldn't find your portfolio. That is assault." My mother stepped closer, trying to project authority. "We will handle this internally, Mara. Your father is speaking with administration right now to clear up this misunderstanding. You will tell Dr. Aris that you fell." I didn't flinch. I didn't argue. "The police are already on their way," I stated. "And Dr. Aris has already logged the injury as blunt force trauma consistent with assault." Brianna's face twisted into a snarl. "You vindictive little," she caught herself as a nurse walked by. "You are going to destroy this family," she whispered furiously. "I am simply providing the documentation," I replied. "You provided the fracture." The complete absence of empathy solidified my resolve. They viewed my physical injury strictly as a public relations crisis. My mother was calculating the potential hit to their social standing, and my sister was calculating the risk to her surgical rotation. I was not a daughter or a sister. I was a liability. The audience of my mind, the quiet observer that had watched this dynamic play out for 22 years, felt a surge of cold, righteous anger. My father finally appeared from the administrative wing, his face flushed with failure. He had tried to pull rank, tried to use his status to erase the records, but he had failed. He looked at me, not with concern, but with the cold calculation of a man whose assets had just been frozen. The war had officially begun. The escalation was immediate and clinical. The morning after the hospital incident, I retained an attorney who specialized in medical malpractice and personal injury. I didn't choose him for his bedside manner. I chose him for his precision. Together with Dr. Aris, who had formally reported the incident to the hospital's medical board ethics committee, we began pulling my childhood medical records. I had fractured my wrist when I was 12. I had suffered a severe concussion at 15. Both times, Brianna had been the cause. Both times, my father had treated me himself. As my attorney audited the files, the true scope of the corruption emerged. Dr. Marcus hadn't just patched me up and kept it quiet. He had systematically miscoded the injuries. He had falsified the official charts, listing my broken wrist as a sports injury and my concussion as a fall down the stairs. He had utilized his access and authority to alter legal medical documents. This wasn't just a father covering up an accident. It was long-term, calculated medical fraud and systematic child abuse. When the ethics committee reviewed the discrepancies, the professional barrier my father had built around himself began to crack. The hospital administration launched a full internal investigation. They suspended Dr. Marcus pending the results. Dr. Aris called to confirm that the state medical board was stepping in. The miscoding of injuries was a severe violation of the Hippocratic Oath. My father hadn't just broken the law, he had violated the core tenets of his profession. The very institution that gave him his power was now stripping it away. I sat in my attorney's office, reviewing the digital copies of the fraudulent charts. I rubbed my eyes, trying to summon a shred of regret or sorrow. But there was only absolute clarity. This wasn't a breakdown. It was a balance sheet. For years, my father had used his medical license as a shield to protect Brianna's violent tendencies, effectively trapping me in a cycle of undocumented abuse. Now, those very documents were going to dismantle his career. The power dynamic had shifted from the personal to the professional. They could not gaslight a subpoena. They could not manipulate an ethics committee. The legal parameters were absolute. Brianna's residency program was notified of the investigation into her history of violence. The hospital where she was training suspended her clinical duties. My mother sent 19 frantic text messages in the span of 4 hours, pivoting wildly from threats to pleas for family loyalty. I read each message with the detachment of an auditor reviewing a bankrupt company's final desperate appeals for a loan. I blocked her number. I blocked Gavin, who had texted to call me a traitor. I blocked my father. The retaliation was relentless, paced with the speed of a falling guillotine. The conflict had ignited at 11:51 the night of the assault. By the following Tuesday, the legal and professional retaliation was fully operational. I didn't ask why they had done it. I didn't care about their psychological motivations. I only cared about the accounting. They had stolen my safety, falsified my history, and expected me to carry the debt forever. I was simply foreclosing on their future. The inevitable confrontation occurred on a Thursday evening. My parents, Brianna, and Gavin arrived at my apartment building unannounced, managing to slip past the concierge. When the knock came, I checked the security camera. They looked frantic, disheveled, and stripped of their usual arrogance. The story of the medical board investigation had just leaked to a local press outlet. The house of cards was actively collapsing. I opened the door but left the chain engaged. I stood there, perfectly still, looking at the 4 people who had dictated my entire existence. "Mara, let us in right now," my father demanded, though his voice lacked its usual booming authority. It sounded thin, reedy, desperate. "We need to come to a private resolution before the media gets worse." "There is no private resolution," I said, my voice cold and methodical. "You are trespassing." My mother pushed forward, her eyes wide with panic. "Mara, please. Your father's legacy is ruined. Brianna has been officially terminated from her residency. We are losing everything. You have to retract the statements. You have to tell the board you were mistaken." I stared at her, analyzing her desperation. It is a profound realization when you see the illusion of power for what it truly is. Their entire status, their social standing, their wealth, and their arrogance, it was all an illusion built on an empty wallet. They possessed no inherent power. Their superiority was entirely dependent on my enforced silence and their fraudulent secrets. Once the secret was exposed, they were exposed. They had no status without the lie. "I am not retracting objective facts," I stated. I unlatched the chain, but I didn't let them in. Instead, I stepped forward and handed my father a thick manila envelope. He took it, his hands shaking slightly. "What is this?" he asked. "Eviction and restitution papers," I replied smoothly. "The attorney has filed a civil suit for the physical and emotional damages stemming from years of documented, miscoded abuse. The financial restitution required will exceed the equity in your home. You will be liquidating your assets to pay me what you owe." Brianna gasped, stepping back as if physically struck. Gavin stared at me, his mouth open, suddenly realizing that his sports car and his trust fund were collateral damage in a war he hadn't bothered to understand. They stood in the hallway, completely paralyzed. They weren't shocked by what they had done. They were shocked that the consequences were actually being applied. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't gloat. This isn't revenge, I told them, watching the reality of their ruin wash over their faces. It is accounting. You accrued a massive debt, and the bill has come due. I stepped back inside my apartment. Do not contact me again. All further communication will go through my legal counsel. I closed the door until it clicked shut. I locked the deadbolt. I stood in the quiet of my entryway and listened to their muffled, panicked voices fading down the hallway. I didn't cry. I didn't feel a shred of guilt. I just walked over to my desk, opened my laptop, and went back to work. The legal fallout concluded with clinical precision over the next 6 months. Dr. Marcus was stripped of his medical license permanently and forced into early, disgraced retirement. He pled guilty to a lesser charge of medical fraud to avoid jail time, but the civil restitution wiped out his savings, his investments, and the equity in their sprawling estate. They were forced to sell the family home at a severe loss just to satisfy the court orders. Cynthia's carefully curated social circle evaporated instantly. Her friends, the ones who used to attend her lavish charity galas, stopped returning her calls the moment the press release hit the internet. She was ostracized, isolated in a small rented apartment, completely stripped of the status she valued more than her own daughter. Brianna, permanently flagged by the ethics board and facing assault charges, lost her residency and was barred from practicing medicine in the state. Her career was over before it began. She was last reported to be working an entry-level administrative job, drowning in hundreds of thousands of dollars of medical school debt that she could no longer repay. Gavin, without the financial safety net he had always taken for granted, had to drop out of his private university when the tuition checks stopped clearing. He was forced to get a minimum wage job to support himself. Their family reputation was not just damaged, it was entirely, permanently eradicated. I didn't stay in the city to watch them pack up their house. I took my settlement, packed my medical illustration supplies, and relocated 2,000 miles away to Chicago. I bought a quiet, sunlit loft with high ceilings and large windows that looked out over the skyline. I partnered with a prestigious university, using my talent to create advanced anatomical textbooks, digital rendering models, and teaching materials for the next generation of surgeons. I used my skills to educate, to clarify, and to build, not to serve my sister's fragile ego or cover up my father's crimes. It is the justice of the planter. True victory does not come simply from watching the toxic roots wither and die in the barren ground they created. True victory is taking your own fertile soil and planting an entirely new life, building something beautiful, robust, and meaningful that has absolutely nothing to do with the people who originally wanted you to fail. I built a career, a safe home, and a supportive community that they could never touch, never claim credit for, and never destroy. It was the ultimate power reversal. I had taken the very anatomy charts and medical knowledge they tried to suppress and used them to forge my absolute independence. As I sat in my new studio, watching the morning light wash over my drafting table, I felt a profound, untouchable sense of peace. The ledgers were balanced. The debts were permanently paid. The balance sheet was finally clear. I've come to realize that you are not obligated to love people who destroy you. We are conditioned by society to believe that blood is an unbreakable bond, a mandatory contract that demands endless sacrifice and infinite forgiveness. But forgiveness isn't always for the other person. Sometimes, it's the only way to set yourself free. Forgiving the situation didn't mean letting them back into my life. It meant releasing my own anger so I could focus entirely on building my future. You do not have to set yourself on fire to keep toxic family members warm. You have the fundamental right to walk away. You have the right to audit your relationships. Look at the historical data and terminate the ones that bring you nothing but pain and diminished returns. Healing isn't a dramatic, sweeping cinematic moment. It is the quiet, daily practice of choosing your own peace over someone else's comfort. It is recognizing that your value is not determined by how much abuse you can quietly absorb. If you've ever had to walk away to save yourself, I want to hear your story. Please like, subscribe, and share this video. You never know who needs to hear that it's okay to choose your own peace.